to the manager, take me to the church, take me to the bank, put you in the dirt, show you what it's worth, put it in my work, put it in my work, put it in my work, take me to the manager, take me to the church, take me to the bank, put you in the dirt, show you what it's worth, put it in my work, put it in my work, put it in my work.
Welcome to Fuel and Property. My name is Taylor Lamel, and I'm really glad you're listening. This is being recorded on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of Wising Art Center. What you just heard actually was a song called Sega Boy by Devin Kilkenny. He's based out of Houston. And his new LP is called, let's see, what's it called? It's called Los Giros de la Siguiente. And that's available on Bandcamp and iTunes. I hear that iTunes pays better dividends. So if you're going to go get that, consider that. All right, so we're just going to get straight into it. We're going to listen to some talks. A few of them I've bought, but most of them are things that I've foraged and would like to revisit with you. And so the first up is a talk or an excerpt of a talk from Gale Lewis, which was originally recorded last year.
So, and also we really are gathering together on the right day, no? We've got the royals out there doing their stuff. We've got the fascists gathering and the anti-racists mobilizing. And we've got us in here in a dark space because we are navigating the waters through and between all of those formations. And it seems to me as well that we're in a particular moment, what I might call the kind of three Britons that we occupy right now. There's Brexit Britain, and the fascists mobilize. And the appeal to white racism that Brexit Britain announces as both as a kind of social and cultural formation, but also as a psychic formation. You know, this is a call to an attempt to Brexit Britain kind of speaks to the need on the part of some, we're told, some who want to occupy the space of whiteness to redeem themselves through a fantasy of wholeness and a fantasy to reclaim the wholeness that none of us can have, alienated subjectivity, but nevertheless there is a fantasy of that. And we know that that's a fantasy located in a register of nostalgia for an imperial Britain. We're also, I think, there's another Britain, in some senses, which generates Brexit Britain, and that's kind of global Britain. The Britain that's organised particularly through finance capital and its mobilisations, its locations, the way in which finance capital creates the borders of the nation, and also that is out with those borders while it goes around the world doing what it wants to, including, unfortunately, led by Premier League football. It's true, there's a fantastic article in the Financial Times from a few weeks ago, Liliane, you may remember when it was, but that really charts the way in which finance capital is using soccer to kind of further cement its place. And that kind of global Britain is in some senses the very Britain that some of those who voted Brexit were voting against. But there are alongside that, and that's perhaps the spaces that we inhabit much more, the multiple diasporic Britons. The Britons of the undercommons, the Britons where we say, maybe we can be something else. Certainly we're going to live our lives in an ordinary way, making claims to perhaps not the state. When I worked in social policy, I used to think that often we were making claims to the state for a kind of citizenship. And now I no longer know that that's right, or indeed is what we should do. But perhaps we can get into a conversation more about that. But certainly those diasporic Britons are the places through which we locate and navigate a kind of fugitivity. A fugitivity that sits in terms of saying, we will be this, we will do this, this is our lives, and it is neither straightforward resistance, but what it is certainly is a kind of refusal against the terms of normativity that you would inscribe.
Okay, so I've been here before.
Through.
We are alone in a room.
So in some senses, I think this notion of Windrush generation is indeed,
and it
certain
isn't
people
my house.
Is a generation, but the notion of
I'm not
Windrush
sure whose house
generation
this is,
acts
actually.
as the placeholder for
But
that
what I do
struggle
know is that we're at the beginning.
between these different kinds of capacities to be.
I'm going to start with something that I ended the last program that I did in this 30th anniversary series, which happened last weekend, which was called Coppice and Drought, and featured Priya J, Daniela Valsjen, and Ebony Fakoya. I read something at the end of that that I'm going to read again because I realized that I didn't finish it. All right. I'm on my way now, again. A highly publicized plane crash left me riddled with anxiety, and everyone agreed that I still wasn't old enough to watch the news and reminded each other to keep it from me. To keep the news from me. You, deciding to address this ridiculousness head on, said, "Listen, I want to talk to you about something. Planes are safe," you said. "You're much more likely to get into a car crash than die in a plane crash," you said. I'm going to say that again. "You're much more likely to get into a car accident than to die in a plane crash," you said. "Now, go to the back because I'm going to yank that tooth out before I go. Do you want me to pull that tooth out or not? I'm super afraid that this is kind of frivolous." "Let him pull it out," they said. "You'll feel better," they said. "He could have been a doctor," they said. "Would have been a doctor if not born in the rural South in 1918. I let you pull out the tooth. You put a string around it and wrap the other end twice around your dense, muscly, sunburnt fist. Atop your wrists there were 2 silver bangles, thick taped tongues that you made yourself, and they clanged once as you pulled swiftly down. Down, coming down, down. When are you coming down? Down on the river, coming down. We're not from Texas, but the stewards all go there for their cancer treatments. Y'all driving to Houston? I noticed that none of you ever fly. And until I was a teenager, you would come get me. And you would fly down sometimes, on that airline that was in the news and later folded. And at the airport, too, at that time, we could show our last name to the gate check ladies in case we got into trouble. I was scared every time I flew, until my early 20s, when I wished my hardest that one of them would just come along and kill me already. Now I'm not too bothered by planes, and if it sneaks up on me, I just make a mental list of all the emails that I wouldn't have to send, deadlines rendered irrelevant. And I'm relaxed. So I wanted to come back to that story because I realized something about it, about this house that I've been in before. The person who pulled out that tooth was not a doctor, no, but that person was a mechanic. And I realized that the point that person was making is that what was in the news was not the thing that was most likely to kill me. That the thing that was most likely to kill me was the thing that I did every day. Now, another thing that happened is that person sent me out one day to pick nuts off a tree. And I picked all day, and I brought back as many bags as I could. And at the end of the day, I was super exhausted, and I handed over the bags, and I expected payment. And I got payment, and it was 20 cents. And I was furious. And some years later, I sent that same person a term paper at the end of my final year in high school from my English class. And I sent that term paper, and the person sent me $20 for this piece of writing. And I realize now, actually, that given the amount of time that it took me to write that term paper, that I also received for that piece of writing 20 cents a day. And so based on this, I'm essentially constructing this fuel and property event, symposium, imagining that what we produce or what we yield from agriculture and culture might actually be the same thing. And I think that Gale is kind of using this or talking about football actually in this way. But I don't watch football, not yet. Maybe I will. Gale might teach me to love it. But I'm talking about art. So next, we're going to hear from someone who has taught me a lot about property in a short time. And that person is Brenna Bandar, whose book, Colonial Lives of Property, is out now. And you should definitely get it.
Land in settler colonies. The third point that I want to make is that the co-articulation of modern property law and racial subjectivity is neither arbitrary nor inevitable, and thinking through some recent histories of this formation in different colonial and post-colonial nation-state forms reveals moments of rupture leading us to the urgent question of how to think and act beyond and outside of private property norms and the ideology of ownership as we currently know these things. Now, in trying to set out in a few minutes how I see modern property law and racial subjectivities as a formation, I explore in the book how this formation really lies at the core of what we can call racial regimes of ownership, so drawing on the work of Cedric Robinson. Now, defining property to begin with is notoriously difficult, particularly when we think about the ever-expanding forms of intellectual property and also the way in which financial markets seemingly enwrap most, if not all, forms of property within their machinations. But here my focus is on real property and land, to be more specific. And I'm also focusing on that form of property that remains hegemonic, which is private property. When we think about state property in colonial contexts, there is an intimate bond between state property and private property ownership in that the latter only materializes on the basis of sovereign colonial claims to underlying or radical title to territory, which in turn lies at the basis of the constitutional legitimacy of the nation state. So that's a very brief way of outlining the relationship between private property ownership, sovereignty, and the nation state form. There is thus an undeniable relationship between the sovereign assertion of control over territory and the mechanisms through which the state organizes individual property ownership, most notably when it comes to the idea of possession. As Ranajit Guha observed in his classic study, A Rule of Property for Bengal, and I quote, "The English often did speak of the company's territories as an estate. England was thus required to assume the responsibilities of an improving landlord in Bengal." Now, property, understood as relations of ownership, still falls prey to the commonly held idea that private property ownership means having absolute control over a thing. So people often think that this is what ownership means, and progressive property theorists often like to trouble this idea by pointing out to all of the restrictions that exist on the rights of owners, at least in countries with presumed political stability. But if property is not only a matter of economy and control of resources, and is also about the social and political imaginaries that subtend and structure property laws, can concepts such as freedom and security, those most tightly associated with the right to own property, be separated from the colonial and imperial formations that gave birth to them? Has the prevailing and persistent idea that ownership means absolute control over a thing shed its history as primary technique of subjugation over the bodies of black people that facilitated massive amounts of capital accumulation by white plantation owners in the Americas? And if we want to just skip to a contemporary moment, we can consider the issue of policing and counterinsurgency from this perspective. That's not only a matter of dehumanizing an other, but it's a matter of a lethal violence which is premised on a sense of entitlement to control the lives and deaths of other people. Freedom to use property, to alienate it, and to enter into contractual relations on the other side, and on the other side of that coin, security from harm, from deprivation, are both still enmeshed in the racial and colonial legacies of property law formation in settler colonies as elsewhere. And in my view, this is the rot that lies at the core of the legal form of property. It is not just an abstract form emptied out of this very complex and bloody history. But this is not the only problem with the close affiliation between property ownership and security. For Jeremy Bentham, the reason for being of property law was really a way of indemnifying owners from the fear of loss. As Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have argued in their most recent book, Assembly, that fear is the true foundation that lies beneath private property's veneer of security. This is a fear, they write, of hunger, homelessness, subordination, and economic crisis. Now, this fear of loss of security, and here we see the nation state rear its head again, not only pertains to the individual as owner, but also to the individual as part of a racial, ethno-national community which takes citizenship as its juridical form. And here the notion of possessive nationalism can be understood as a corollary of possessive individualism. For the possessive individual, the value of property ownership lies not only in the material power it affords the owner, but also in ownership being posited as the path to full personhood, citizenship, and belonging within the nation state.
Basically, I interpret this to mean that the possessive individual who would, I think, obviously have a fantasy of wholeness, as Gale was saying, also has a fear of loss.
To control one's possessions absolutely, to deal with the need for security and to calm the fear of losing one's property are here transmuted to the stage of the nation state. The possessive individual develops a close identification with national identity. As I explore through the book the rationales for the assertion of colonial sovereignty as well as individual property ownership, each had counterparts in the creation of racial subjectivities. So, for example, the commodity logic of abstraction that underlies modern systems of title registration was first perfected in the settler colony of Australia, so before it then boomeranged back to the UK some 60 or 70 years later. So I argue that commodity logic of abstraction that underlies that system of title registration found its counterpart in the abstract figure of the savage based on emerging racial taxonomies that were used to justify colonial settlement on the basis of the terra nullius doctrine. The ideology of improvement, based on English agrarian capitalism, find one of its historical antecedents in Ireland, where William Petty devised a method of measuring the value of land that was contingent upon the value of the labor of the Irish peasantry, a value shaped by their perceived racial, and that combined biological and cultural notions of race based on their racial inferiority. In the late 19th century, early Zionists in Palestine viewed existing modes of cultivation as a reflection of an inferior intellectual capacity of the natives and their less developed culture. So land that required improvement was held by people who themselves required improvement. The Zionist ideology that combined theological and political redemption through a return to the land today remains a bulwark against contemporary legal claims of Bedouin communities seeking the return of their lands from the Israeli state. Now, the sheer heterogeneity contained within articulations of race and property ownership mean that there are, to borrow from Stuart Hall, no guarantees that a given articulation of race and property ownership will appear in the same configuration across time or jurisdictions. And this heterogeneity, in my view, is not only a result of capitalism's cunning ability to continually reproduce itself anew, or it's not due to the plasticity of the legal form itself, but is also occasioned by the resistance, refusal, or negotiation with colonial relations of ownership by First Nations and other racialized subjects. The continual renewal of racial regimes of ownership bears witness both to continually evolving forms of primitive accumulation, as well as the fact that these regimes of ownership are not inevitable, but rather vulnerable.
So, yeah, like I said, everything that I'm playing today is an excerpt, and somewhere, I don't know where right now, but somewhere by the time you get this, it will be visible to you where you can get the whole thing if you're interested in hearing what came before or after what I've kind of plucked out for these purposes. I think we're gonna hear another song from Devin Kilkenny right now. One thing I should say, you've now heard everything that I have prepared to say. From this point out, I'm gonna be improvising because I haven't been able to afford the time to prepare. The music is your coffee break, by the way, or your wine break, or your snack break. So go get your snacks if you need them. But also keep listening to Devin Kilkenny, because I think Devin Kilkenny is amazing.
Just daydreams, wondering what we could do.
Devin, who, like I said, is working out of Houston right now, is mashing up screwed and chopped music and cumbia, and we're gonna come back to that.
Think I may have learned the new definition of true love, of true love. Could I have thinking, what did I do?
Okay, so I remember that I said to y'all earlier that I wanted to talk about what is yielded when we work on something that's called art. And I think specifically, and I believe I put this in the description to this event, that I wanted to talk about performance. And we're going to get into that in a second. With, in my opinion, a very deep cut from one of the best. So we'll hear that in a minute. What did I want to say? I think that's it for now.
Condition. What it is that makes us smarm up to one person and be weak and silly and frivolous. I mean, that's not a bad thing to be frivolous, I don't mean that. But what on the other hand makes us be haughty to another person and look down on him or her, and how we can fall and fail and stumble and somehow rise and get our stuff together again and start out again. So I write about a poor black girl in Arkansas, or a young black woman in San Francisco, but an Asian man in Hong Kong reads it and says that's the truth about human nature.
I'm still going to persist, though.
So this
What
is an
you're
interview
present
between
is,
Maya
for one thing,
Angelou
it's magnetic,
and
particularly on that stage. It's
somebody
magnetic.
from London.
Now, where did you?
That occurred
How did you arrive at it? That's
in 1984 in
confidence,
London,
I
and
know
it was an
what I
interview that
want to
was
achieve,
taking
maybe.
place before
And I'm
one
not,
of Maya
I'm
Angelou's
not being
performances.
modest. I told you before, I have no modesty. Modesty is dangerous. It's a learned affectation. And as soon as the modest person gets slammed against the wall by life, modesty will drop off faster than a G-string from a stripper. You know, it's baloney, modesty. I hope to be humble. Humility is from within. And so that keeps you honest and try to be simple and so forth. So I have no modesty. But I know theater. I write for it. I have studied it. I act in it every now and again. So I know theater, and I'm centered. So when I go into the stage, I bring everybody on with me. Now that's another thing. Mavis, this is the hottest. This is the best. I bring everybody who's ever loved me and taught me and supported me onto the stage with me in my mind.
Do you mean you think
Yes.
about them?
Yes.
So that they're there for your confidence?
That's right. I say, come on.
Like when you're ill in hospital, you
That's
go
right.
through all the list of the people that could be loving you at
That's
that
right.
moment, right?
I bring them all so that an audience says she has charisma. The truth is they can't see all these shadows that are there. Some black, some white, some male, some female, who have dared to love me. And so they're all there. I say, let's go.
You've written 4 autobiographies,
Yeah.
5 autobiographies, darling. You must know yourself pretty well.
And wait now, Mavis, what I know a lot of facts and some truth. But you see, facts can be very dangerous because they can obscure the truth. You can tell so many facts, you haven't told, an inch of truth. You say, and it was on 1917, and it was then, and then his name was, and so, and you give the facts.
We believe you, you know.
Yes, but what I try to do is tell the truth. I try to go behind the facts and say, this is really what was happening. This is what the air smelled like. This was the weight of the heat on my skin. This is how my nose was itching and the adrenaline was pouring through so that those glands were moving under my arms and my kneecap was slipping and so forth.
I think we live rather vicariously through your life, you know. Because you've done so much. You've upped and changed. Yeah?
Yes.
And you've been successful. And you rise.
Yes.
And you're rising.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now then, why is it that you can do that? Most of us get a kind of comfy idea of ourselves and we stick with it, don't we? You don't.
No.
Why not?
Well, I know that we're all in process, and as nice as this seat is and this room is, and how nice it is to be with you and have some relatives in the background, and respectful and gracious directors and producers and floor managers around, this too will change. This will change. I know it. This cannot remain the same.
No, but that's a...
Wait, let me just
All right,
be right
all right.
on it. In an hour, you'll be gone. All these folks will be gone. I will be sitting here alone, preparing myself, in truth, for another performance of strangers, alone, except from one sister from Geneva, alone. Tomorrow morning, I won't see her. I'll be on the plane with another brilliant and strong young woman to Scotland. I will go from there. I will be on a plane to Liberia. I will be back in my home. All of this will change. It would be foolish of me to think that I've got it now.
No, but I mean, those are little changes in a way, like moving from one place to another, but you're still Maya Angelou, university professor, or reading poetry in a place. What I'm saying is that your life changed quite dramatically in many, many ways. You've changed from all kinds of things.
Yes.
Keeping a whorehouse, yes, to becoming a singer, to becoming a dancer, to being a mother always. You change.
I think that...
You changed your country. You went from America to Africa. Most of us, as I say, stay put within confines. Now, has that been, because you've changed so much, a loss to your personal life in any way?
Oh, and rather, it enriched. I think that in a book of mine called Gather Together in My Name, I dealt with the house of prostitution. I was 18. I had no idea. But I had bravado. No bravery, just bravado. I mean, it was all superficial. And I don't see a qualitative difference. I still have a lot of bravado. And I'm trying to grow into braveness, grow into courage. But I know that I didn't come here to stay. I didn't come to this earth to stay any more than I came to London to stay. I'm in process. So I do the best I can all the time. And I say, bye. I may weep and gnash my teeth and wring my hands, but I'm gone.
What's the restlessness about?
Well,
if it's restless.
If it is restless, it's just that I think that people need a little more restlessness. Why? Why do you assume? The only promise that will not be reneged upon is you will die. I mean, if you know that that's a big bugaboo and you're going to do that, you may as well try to do some other wonderful things in the meantime.
You've been married 3 times. Sort of.
Well,
Or
more or less.
less.
I mean, maybe more.
All right, more. Well, all
Let's say
Let's
more.
assume. Now, does that mean that you have found love rather difficult to stick with?
No, I find love lovely. It's just that it too, it goes. I've just written a new song for Roberta Flack called And So It Goes. Love is a rush of wild, wild wind. It comes,
I would have played that song,
and it
but I wasn't
goes,
going to buy
and
the
so
rights.
It goes. So I won't stay in a relationship if there's no love there.
It hurts though when it
Oh,
leaves
it's
you.
awful. Gosh, it's awful.
Mm.
I mean, it's as if it's a beautiful aroma in the room, and it's been there, maybe some incense or perfume or fried potatoes and onions, those two are lovely
Bacon and
things.
eggs.
Bacon and eggs, or coffee and stuff. And then it's gone. You think, what did I do wrong? It's always, each person asks, I do anyway, I ask, what did I not do? Where did I blow it?
You blame yourself.
Well, I question myself. There's a world of difference.
There's a difference.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't blame myself. I do not do that. I won't waste any time with that. I do the best I can. People can only do what they know to do. That is all they can do. Anybody. So I do the best I can do. And I look back and think, was that really the best? Yeah, I didn't know anymore. Well, there we are.
Early
like
on,
this
when
clip.
your mother said,
I like
Black
this
people
clip
can't
because it
change
coalesces
because
a lot of
white
the things
people
that I
won't
feel.
change.
My mother, when I married,
I'll come back to it. I like this story.
my mother was so disgusted with me that I had married a white man. She moved a 14-room house 2 days before the wedding, 500 miles away. 14 rooms.
what, not to be there?
That's
not
right.
to.
Remember these
But what was
houses.
her
We're gonna.
opinion,
I think we'll come back to
She was
that
saying,
if you
how
come
can you?
to Wising on the
I mean,
30th of
who
May
is he?
to the
Who
last
are
in the
his
series,
people?
which
How
is called
can
Network
we?
and Contact.
But
I'm
then
going to
she
talk about
fell
houses
for him.
in that
He was a good husband.
in that program.
He was a
I
good
think.
father.
So
She
one of
fell
the
for him.
things
So
actually
a
that I
few
really
years
like
later
about
when
this
I
talk
said to
is
her,
that it
I'm leaving him,
coalesces
she said, how can
a lot
you?
of elements. One, this idea of the best that we can do. I'm not sure whether I've said this or not. Like I said, because I'm improvising and I'm trying to maintain a certain level of presence. But one of the things I really like is the idea of the best thing that we can do. And I want to make very clear that to me, this symposium, quote unquote, that I've quote unquote curated is not finished. It's a reflection of where I'm at in my understanding of these concepts at this particular moment. And it does represent the best that I can do at this particular moment. The other thing is I think, she's talking about performance, but she's also, and who you bring with you and what fuels your performance, but she's also talking about property and different ways in which she has owned and been owned, let's say. And another reason I chose the clip, and this is the same for every clip that I've foraged for you today, is also the nature of her voice. The quality of her voice, and I think that you should assume that everything you're about to hear means that I think or I feel that there is something to be yielded from the quality of the person's voice who is reading. I want to take a quick moment before we get into the next clip to just shout out Jay. Who manages the everything digital at Wising Art Center. Jay's doing like boop, boop, boop. Jay just started here and a few months ago, don't know, and is amazing, and is gonna do some really cool things, I think. So thank you, Jay, for helping me put this together. The next thing that we're gonna listen to is another person who talks very eloquently about property, and also who I'm fairly certain has a very good understanding through proximity to many poets and performers, also about the nature of how to deliver one's writing, and what could be yielded from that. And that person is Cheryl Harris. And this clip that we're about to get into is from a talk that she gave in relation to an essay that she wrote in, I want to say 1995, called Whiteness as Property. And so we'll get into that first. And then we're going to do something a little bit funny. So I intended to do very many interviews for this. But as I said, as time is money, we know that from, well, not only the old adage, but also the first poem of Daniela Valjean's Subversive Economies, that time is money. And I didn't buy with my time or for my time. I bought listening time. I didn't buy enough speaking time, or I didn't buy as much speaking time as I intended to. So anyway, we're going to do primarily listening. But one of the things that I did manage to buy with this time is an interview between myself and Emma Bazi-Okon, who you'll hear from a bit later. And we're going to, from this point on, we're going to jump back and forth quite quickly, I think, in between Cheryl Harris, Emma Bazi-Okon. And I also think I'm going to play a clip that I really love. It's an old, or not old, but it's a talk from a while ago from someone called Marina Vishmet, who Emma Bazi and I talked a lot about. Don't worry, we'll recap that as we go along. First is Cheryl Harris, Whiteness as Property.
I want to argue is also a racially specific pattern that he traces in history. Despite efforts to obscure the central role of slavery and indigenous dispossession in narratives of nationhood, these realities are deeply imprinted in the relationship between race and markets and property. Through slavery and native dispossession, race and economic domination are fused. Earlier in Whiteness as Property, I considered how this relationship legitimated whiteness as a form of property under law, a property that maintains its value even as over time certain forms of racial domination change or recede. Extending these thoughts, I would argue that racial hierarchy is continually replenished through the market, while the market encodes property in accord with racial premises. The imprint of race is erased, albeit incompletely, through the market and market rhetoric. So, quote unquote, the market functions not only as a location where exchange occurs, but where dispossession of land, property, and persons is legitimated. Financialization, securitization have been historically key to this process, what Peggy Radin describes as thingification, and the appraisal through markets is critical to its operation today. My focus here is on the afterlife of slavery, but I should make clear that I see this as one part of a critical project of mapping out how dispossession is part of the apparatus of settler colonialism. And this involved the construction and deployment of different racial logics and technologies that enabled the taking of Native American land and the genocidal violence visited upon them. The market, depicted as neutral and driven only by rational and inexorable laws of supply and demand, is far from neutral, as embedded within it are racial norms, presumptions, ideologies, and structures. Racial regimes shape how people enter the market, whether they enter as subjects or whether they enter as objects. Slavery, of course, defined enslaved bodies, their labor, and their offspring as property, as assets which were valued, assessed, and appraised. This history is largely obscured even among those who acknowledge the existence of the institution, in part, I think, because the trope of the plantation and the family have overdetermined the history and historiography of American slavery. This is the space in which I understand new studies of U.S. capitalist development have intervened, rejecting an understanding of slavery as a pre-capitalist kind of feudal enterprise. In opposition to this view is the work of historians like Walter Johnson, Robert Blackburn, who have documented the importance of slavery to the economic production of the nation and the accumulation of Northern and British capital. Afro-Caribbean historians, of course, have long been on this case. I mean, it's for quite a while. But even beyond the role of slavery in building European and the so-called New World economic power, slavery as a racial project was central to the development of capitalism. Indeed, my colleague at UCLA, Peter Hudson, has some very exciting new work which centers on the race and economic history through understanding banking, not only as an economic institution, but he argues as a cultural one. If we resist the dominant trope of the plantation, he suggests, as a way of understanding, say, for example, Caribbean political economy, one could advocate for a kind of critical history of banking as what he calls, quote, both subject and method of cultural studies and African diaspora history. In his forthcoming book, Banking on Empire, he actually relates a history of banking in the Caribbean, illustrating how the region served as a testing ground for new mechanisms of internationalization of capital, a critical geography through which the relationship between imperialism and U.S. financial institutions was formed. So in addition to the role of black labor in commodity production, we cannot forget that enslaved bodies were themselves commodities under slavery. And of course, there have been histories that have documented this too. Most recently, Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, talking about the domestic slave trade, which indicates that after the ban in 1808, the market became central in the expansion and the growth of slavery, with over 1 million enslaved Africans being sent from the Upper South to the fields and industries of the Lower North. This market filled the dominant white class demand for both labor and pleasure. And pleasure.
And pleasure.
The posting of enslaved Africans as collateral allowed for increased lending through mortgages, which themselves funded by the banks through the sale of bonds in the global market. These bonds were backed by human collateral. Black people themselves were securitized, and investors, even those in free territory and countries, profited.
Remember
the increase
bonds.
in productivity and profit were the direct result of the violent system of exchange ratified and enacted by state power. So the imprint of this racial logic is what I'm trying to trace now. And it remains, I think, particularly salient because it defines sort of who is a proper economic subject and who is not. And all of these questions still deeply implicate race. You all may have noticed that there's been a recent tumble in the Chinese stock market.
Remember this example as well.
This recent upheaval that has produced aftershocks here has really had some interesting sort of reverberations. And so I've been not following a lot, but looking at some of the sort of dominant consensus commentary of the pundit class about what this all means. And a lot of the analysis basically goes along the lines of saying the problem is that the Chinese intervened in the market, that they were still unwilling to fully put their trust in the market. The fact that China had built these so-called circuit breakers to stop trading once the valuations fell below a certain level, and that these had not, in fact, stopped the free fall, this was all taken as evidence of the folly of the enterprise of directly intervening in the market, as well as the fact that the Chinese were really still, despite all of their wealth and resources, still unpracticed at being pure capitalist, right? They needed additional tutelage, apparently, and relying on and trusting, quote unquote, the market, which inexorably follows basic laws such as supply and demand. The fact that after the worldwide economic collapse in 2008, anybody can be scolded for failing to trust the market is really quite stunning. But it says something about the durability of certain premises and their immunity to facts. This rhetoric also has undertones of a kind of racialized presumption about master and pupil that's rendered even more ironic given the rickety state of the US economic situation. The racial subjectivity, though, is what I'm arguing here is key to how the market functions. And it takes me back, of course, as always, to Du Bois, his thesis regarding the formation and investments of the white working class in what he called the wages of whiteness. As Du Bois argued, whiteness conferred both material and psychological advantages. At times, quote, they, that is the white working class, received higher pay for the same work or were given access to work denied to blacks. But as he put it in Black Reconstruction, quote, even when whites received a low wage, they were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions and public parks. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent on their votes, treated them with leniency. Their votes elected public officials, and while this has had small effect on their economic situation, it had great effect on their personal treatment. So this foundational insight, which of course inspired the landmark text by David Roediger, The Wages of Whiteness, has also resonances with recent work in anthropology on capitalism. Karen Ho, among others, have been working on this question, and in an article called, or a piece called White Male Fraternity and the Making of Markets, she provides what I think is a very useful elaboration of how, in fact, psychological benefits can take on material form. And so she draws on, she says she's examining the extent to which, in the US, most normative markets, from the job market to the housing market to capital markets to financial markets, are fueled by and constructed through whiteness and white racial fraternity. She draws on, in turn, on the work of a colleague of mine named Sumi Cho, who did a really powerful critique of some of the new work in economic sociology. And some of this work you may be familiar with. It's about the idea of weak ties, sort of supplanting the old sort of blood ties as a mechanism for transferring information, networks, hiring, and so forth. And the idea here is that we've sort of moved into an area where the way in which people acquire information, knowledge, jobs, economic goods is through these weak ties. What's very interesting and what Sumi points out is that the studies that have been done to sort of demonstrate the existence and, I guess, viability of these weak ties are all studies that look at the ways in which these weak ties rely on trust, reliability, and credibility. But as she points out, all of the studies were basically 99% white and virtually all male. And so the desired traits that bolster and make weak ties possible are actually racially encrypted. These are characteristics that are in fact the characteristics of the white male fraternity. And as Ho argues, the market is not a neutral field from which certain people are merely excluded. It is rather constructed through normative assumptions and connections to white male subjectivity and the traits associated with the proper economic subject. As she points out, this makes it very difficult to talk about expanding and reforming markets, but it also explains for me why, in part, inclusion and incorporation into the market, as well as exclusion from the market, can function as a form of racial subordination. That is, both can function in this way. So the presumption of racial neutrality of white racial networks is what we really have, and that's also part of the magic, because race gets disappeared under this regime. Slavery, however, as we know well, did not end the structure of racial domination that it produced and was produced by. Its afterlife has been prominently mapped through work on the carceral state. The market continued to serve as a mode of exchange for buying and selling black bodies after the end of slavery. And Cameron turns our attention to this. This was not metaphoric. Douglas Blackman, of course, Slavery by Another Name, most famously has talked about how in the age of neo-slavery, the convict leasing system operated to build and accumulate capital, bodies leased to private industry as a fully fungible labor force, the steel industry, coal industry, railroad, all of this built on this labor. And at some point, the fact that convict leasing undercut the value of free labor presented a contradiction that was resolved by restricting prison labor to the state use as an aspect of liberal reform. That's one way of thinking about the chain gang. It was a kind of liberal reform of convict leasing. Tracing this to the present, inmates are, of course, consumers as well. They're consumers of goods and of services associated with their incarceration. Anybody who's ever tried to stay in contact with anybody who's incarcerated knows something about the phone fees that are associated with that. They're absolutely confiscatory. And that's part of what I guess I'm saying in terms of their incarceration does not keep them from having to be positioned as consumers. So apart from sort of the development of prison industries, we have commodities that are produced by prison labor becoming available to private nonprofit organizations, and this is part of what Cameron's work is pointing our way to. This economic circuitry demonstrates once again the intimate relationship among race markets and the carceral state. But elaborating from these insights, we might consider other dimensions and consequences of these relationships and map the terrain more broadly apart from the criminal sanction system. The criminalization of black people, particularly as Blackman describes, was tied to the creation of debt, with widespread and often fraudulent claims by whites that blacks owed them a debt, and the arrest of those unable to pay with the assessment of fees, etc. What is striking is that the role that debt continues to play in the operation of racial capitalist markets. At the same time that black people are excluded from markets, job, housing, capital, etc., reflecting their devaluation as economic subjects, so-called liberal reform continues to incorporate blackness into finance capital as sources of, quote, high-risk debt. Black spaces, I argue, are forever unstable, subprime, and prone to being declared to be waste, making them always available for reappropriation through various technologies such as debt, regulation and deregulation, and development. And
one of the things that I get into with Emma Bazzi later is
economic predations that I'm describing here are visited only on black people, but rather that its forms and logics and justifications
Cheryl Harris is talking about it here,
sitting within a deep
useful,
racial stew,
to think of as a metaphor,
and that cannot be extracted.
What is exchanged when one brings
it's probably
one's
also
own body
worth
into
knowing,
a space to perform.
noting that central to this story is, of course, the corporate structure, which became central to how capital is organized. And so attractive features of corporations are that they limit liability, they facilitate exchange, they allow for the raising of capital, and they also allow for multiple or complex organizational forms, as well as facilitating securitization and commodification. As an aside, I might note that while corporate personhood has come under some degree of scrutiny as a result of the Citizens United decision that allowed or that struck down regulations on corporate contributions on the ground that it was restricting corporate speech. What I think is less understood is that the corporation is not simply a 14th Amendment person to whom constitutional rights attach.
Let's just go straight to the next thing, I think.
A piece of paper money is almost always a representation, a symbol that claims to stand for something else or to be something else. It is not that paper depicts and represents coins, but that paper, coins, and money generally all stand in the place of something else. End of quote. I can't remember who that's from. Hence, financialization is a radicalization of
this
this
is like
condition
so
of money,
real.
bringing it closer to art.
Yeah, but
just as art tried to get closer to money in dematerializing. which ironically was framed as a strike against the commodity status of art.
So is that art trying to be a promissory note?
The hermetic quality of speculation as it subsists in art and in finance can also be approached via the opacity and exoticism of new financial instruments.
That's a good question.
I don't think I understand that
anymore.
But that's what she's saying, like, because
their opacity is key
if money
to
is
their
like a
profitability, which can be
promissory
compared
note, so
to
before
contemporary art
like
or modern art in
basically
general.
it was
The
agriculture,
closer a
right?
commodity
That you would
approaches the pure
exchange
exchange
goods, like
value, the less it needs to exhibit
those
any
trainers
evident
are
trace of what it is or what it
nowhere
does.
near like Kanye's.
This in turn links back to the symmetry between the
boosts,
limitlessness
right?
of capital
So
as
you'd give me two of
self-expanding
those,
value
and then I'll give you
and the infinite
Kanye's one.
creativity
And they're like, okay,
of artistic
it's stupid for
subjectivity.
us to be carrying oxes up
The
this hill.
speculative form of value is
Like,
key to both,
and then they're like, okay,
insofar as both art and money,
IOUs.
the former certainly since
So like,
Kant's
this is
notion of
like,
aesthetic
and then they've got
judgment,
rid of like
was
the
developed
physical product
and
entirely,
generalized.
and it became just
Come
dealing
heavily
with. So actually,
encoded
money
with
is
freedom.
nothing.
In capitalist society,
It's just like
freedom structured by
it's
specific absences.
what's the
One
word?
of these
It's
is
like
the
it's
erasure
like
of
an
labor.
exaggeration, right?
Art
It's
and
like
finance both depend
someone
on
has
the
just told us that this
subjugation and
thing values
expropriation
that,
of
and we
labor in
believe
order
it,
to realize
but
their
actually
value
it
in the
doesn't.
market.
It doesn't mean anything.
This subjugation and
And
expropriation
so like the
also
idea is
has
like
to,
what they do is like
perhaps
they press the
preeminently,
money according to how
happen
much bullion or
symbolically.
gold that you have.
The invisibility
Which is super
of labor,
interesting because, like,
labor
in
which is
Zimbabwe
deemed
now-
profane
Did I
and
tell you about what happened
unproductive
there?
of this freedom that only
We're
money
supposed to
can
be listening to
guarantee,
this, aren't we?
is a result of the emergence of
Okay,
speculation as a template for economic,
I can turn it
but
down.
also personal
No, it's
and
cool.
social valorization.
So
When money makes money and workers are encouraged to see
the
themselves as human
Zimbabwean
capital.
dollar was like worth nothing.
Where one
Like with a
society
lot
was
of like
structured by
African
divergent class
currencies, like
interests, the loss of the
they're
challenge that
it's
labor
just it's
posed to capital,
ridiculous. And
that
so
abuse value
they
to exchange
abandoned it,
value
like
if
stopped
labor
that, and
is
just
seen as one
adopted
side
the
of
US dollar.
capital-labor relation.
But it was
It means that it
never
now finds itself in a
an agreement with the
self-referential loop
USA.
of
So
the
when the
sociological
USA found out,
speculation.
Obama imposed
This
sanctions and stopped
self-referentiality,
any
as
stopped
opposed to the
dollars going
harmonious
into
self-regulation that neoclassical
into Zimbabwe.
economics has used to model social
So
relations
basically,
on market
what the government in
transactions,
Zimbabwe have now done
produces a
has
kind
introduced
of
a
loss
bond
of
note.
measuring capacity.
So they're pressing this
This
money,
loss has been called the obsolescence
and they have
of the law
floated
of
it as
value by writers
one-to-one
such as
to the
Nedry,
dollar,
Hart, Very
based on
Newman,
their
and Zahara.
own
But
Yeah,
perhaps
based
such
on
an
nothing.
erosion of
based
measures
on nothing
speaks simply of the
whatsoever.
great expansion
And what they've
of
done
that
is
law
cleared
and
everyone's
its
bank
fatal
account out of dollars because
naturalization.
they understand that those dollars are worth money, and
Art
everyone's
operates in
trading
these
in
conditions,
bond
but
notes.
also upon them to transform
So if
their
someone from
terms.
Zimbabwe wanted to go to
As
the Bureau
speculative
de Change,
commodities, art
that
is
bond
backed
note
by
won't
the
be
credibility
recognised
of the
anywhere
artist and
else,
money
any
by
other
the
country.
credibility
any
of the
other
state.
country.
But do you feel like that's kind
Yet
of
art is engaged in an endless testing of its own condition, which anticipates negations of the value formed from the inside.
I don't want to phrase things as like good or bad.
No,
You know,
I find it
necessarily.
interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of questions there.
Yeah. Okay, tell me what they are.
Because essentially, Zimbabwe has just done what the world has done.
How so?
The World Bank has done in terms of like that's what they've done. They have decided what is value, and what is equivalent and what's not. They've decided what the dollar is valued at as opposed to the yen. Right? Like for instance, the status quo to those people who kind of like maybe have more, not more clout, but like more weight, or have probably are given more privilege, have set these scales according to, so that it's always beneficial to them, right? We saw that with Greece and Germany, right? That's a whole other conversation, right? And all Zimbabwe's done is just done it.
Yeah, for the interior.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that, like, I agree with that, and I think actually more people should do that. More countries should do that, actually.
Oh, really? Why?
Because actually it's like, because if it works within, the only problem is because then it doesn't stay until like people want to come out. That's where the problem starts. And also because the government is not necessarily honest, they're a bit corrupt. And so people are losing their money. You know, so someone has kind of got like maybe say £1,000, they've taken that away, $1,000, and given them 1,000 bond notes. They have lost money, basically. Like they
have lost the ability to trade in other markets,
basically.
Yeah,
and so does that make so they can only trade in one place, and I think that could be quite interesting in this thing where, like similar to like maybe what Japan did after the war, they just close all export and just like let's focus on building ourselves up, and I think that could be quite important when you turn your eyes inwards. And I think like let's fix, or like let's kind of like what's the word, invest in ourselves. But that at the moment it's kind of futile because you can't, because we're in such a position where a lot of the things that you rely on now are based on your relationships or your deals with these external relationships, you know. Yeah. So in of itself, I think it's a really interesting thing and a really kind of like radical thing to kind of just say, you know what, fuck your system. I'm just producing my one, and we're just going to operate in that. You know, like in a way, it's like a community. It's in a way, it's almost like a co-op.
And then, well, that, yeah, it's funny. That's what I was thinking about when like you said that.
It is, but like that's the ideal way of looking at it, right? Like when someone says, okay, you know what, we're going to kind of extract ourselves from this. We're going to go and live off grid here, and we're going to kind of like have this kind of like non-like hierarchical kind of like system, and blah blah blah. Like that's kind of what they've done, but it's fraught with lots of other different things.
What, like fascism?
Yeah, and just like other things that were like corrupt from the beginning, so it can't be a benevolent thing that they've done. You know.
Okay, right. So you're interested in the mechanism of like having, essentially, I guess, kind of tried to create like a financial biosphere. Let's say.
Yeah, totally.
More than the idea of closing borders as like a literal like necessary. Or as a literal necessity to changing the kind of like financial system within any given geography. So I think now I'm going to play for you all that talk that was playing in the background of Emma Bazzi and my conversation, and we are going to come back to that conversation in a second. This is a talk from 2012 by Marina Vishma, as I've said, and then after that we're going to take a little tiny another music break. We're going to go back to Devin, who I have brought into this house from somewhere that is closer to my house. Although I do think one of the things that Brenna's talk earlier is very useful for is interrogating the idea about why we even think we have a house. But anyway, I might wait till the 30th to get in on that. You might have to come see me in person to get into that with me. Okay, now we're going to go to Marina, and then we'll take a little short break with Devin, and then we'll restart again with this imaginary conversation that's happening in my head between Cheryl, Emma Bazzi, and Marina.
And then go on to drone through this text. So, the first quote is from the. Do I keep speaking in the wrong direction? Okay, I should be able to hear myself amplified. Okay. The Swiss economist and author and post-autonomist thinker Christian Marazzi. And he says, to measure value is, first of all, to pose the question of the crisis of value. The unit of measure of the process of valorization is the crisis. The mechanism of exploitation is unveiled through the crisis, and the material conditions of liberation are posed by the crisis. This is where I want to arrive at. He says, so I guess another maybe shortcoming of what I'm going to read is it doesn't have the more kind of updated analysis. It's a slightly older text, or certainly not about the particular questions about debt that I wanted to talk about in terms of news or things I've recently come across that I integrated into the talk. The next quote is from the poet J.H. Prynne, and it's from a poem called Towards a Financial Theory of the Self. At least that's part of the title. And how much we hope for, it is the primacy of count. This is the shining grudge of numbers, the name we will not lose to any possible stranger. So this text contains excerpts taken from a larger body of research, which sets itself the task, or the ordeal, of drawing a link between the expansion of the category of art and the expansion of the value form in recent social and economic life. To make this link, I call on the double meaning of speculation. as speculation as creative thought and as financial speculation. This double meaning then can provide the connection between the subject and the commodity. So just some general correspondences I had in mind within that rubric. The social character of art is a deeply contradictory one. Artistic autonomy can be understood as art's immanence to its own laws, and heteronomy as the social determinations external to those laws. From the critical view of how this autonomy is produced, it follows that art's autonomy is only an effect of heteronomy, meaning that it is the dominance of abstract labor and value that produces art as an exception to it, or which is inscribed into it as an exception. The lack of content of the value form, its disconnection from any utility except its own expansion, is most clearly expressed in two spheres, art and money. The social existence of art as a distinct sphere of human endeavor corresponds with the value form insofar as indeterminacy is the basis of both. The value form is a way of organizing and extracting surplus from human production, social production, and increasingly reproduction, and jeopardizing that division. And art is a materialization or socialization of that surplus as open-ended speculation, in the sense of speculative thought and practice. This speculation is suffused with the ideological freight of open-endedness, the utopian moment, that is also corollary to capital. The relationship between the unconditioned, so-called unconditioned, that is art, and the pure abstraction that is the core of capital, the pure algebra of value, which is not to downplay the more strictly ideological, so to speak, role of art as affirmation of freedom in capitalist social relations, the services rendered by autonomy. So a very, very kind of succinct, slightly satirical statement about that is from a text by Diedrich Diedrichson, where he writes, "There is nothing that bourgeois culture values more highly than the break with its own economic principles, provided that it is capable of valuing this break economically. This has nonetheless led to great freedoms. In particular, has given rise to the ethic of a freedom as devoid as possible of anything that can be valued economically. While this ethic has always been ideologically contaminated, it was still extremely productive, as the avant-gardes of the 20th century witnessed." So, at the same time, over the past several decades, we've witnessed a dramatic expansion of art's domain, a tendency which has been gathering force since the advent of the ready-made. As Seth Price writes, quote, "The last 100 years of work indicate that it's demonstrably impossible to destroy or dematerialize art," and he capitalizes art. It is a manifesto, which, like it or not, can only gradually expand, voraciously synthesizing every aspect of life. So that's from his ever-remixed text, Dispersal, which is on remixing. Such an expansion is an index of the crisis in the relations of production that have kept art and its intimate others, labor or money, separate. This separation can no longer hold, once that crisis is considered to be not only a malfunctioning of the subset of valorization called finance, but a crisis in the capital-labor relation more generally, a crisis that derives from the terminal logic for capital of finance as abstraction. The social expansion of finance and the expansion of art should be seen in strict analogy with the contraction of labor. Both are processes of real abstraction, as it were. They render the processes of social domination ever more abstract in daily life and ever more outside the sphere of political contestation, while locating it more and more integrally within the sphere of finance. The so-called disjunctive synthesis, which is a phrase from Deleuze, between art and finance as two modes of speculation, can initially be addressed through the analogy between works of art and what is called innovative financial instruments. This has been discussed by Melanie Gilligan, among others, as the phenomenon of contemporary art operating in reference to and deriving its value from elsewhere, as financial derivatives do. On this point, it can be argued that the reference of art to what is outside it by virtue of its own distance from it, has been the constituting factor of all art once it became autonomous or dislodged from religion and ritual. It can be said, however, that this autonomy was never completed, given art's ongoing relation to the rituals of wealth and power, especially if culture can itself be understood as a ritual of class distinction. Money and art are both representational, but when art takes a conceptual turn, it also behaves like money, through its enactment of forms of nomination, credit, a piece of, and I quote here, a piece of paper money is almost always a representation, a symbol that claims to stand for something else or to be something else. It is not that paper depicts and represents coins, but that paper, coins, and money generally all stand in the place of something else. End of quote. I can't remember who that's from. Hence, financialization is a radicalization of this condition of money, bringing it closer to art, just as art tried to get closer to money in dematerializing, which ironically was framed as a strike against the commodity status of art. The hermetic quality of speculation as it subsists in art and in finance can also be approached via the opacity and exoticism of new financial instruments. Not so new anymore. Everyone knows about them. Their opacity is key to their profitability, which can be compared to contemporary art, or modern art in general. The closer a commodity approaches to pure exchange value, the less it needs to exhibit any evident trace of what it is or what it does. This in turn links back to the symmetry between the limitlessness of capital as self-expanding value and the infinite creativity of artistic subjectivity. The speculative form of value is key to both, insofar as both art and money, the former certainly since Kant's notion of aesthetic judgment was developed and generalized, come heavily encoded with freedom in capitalist society, a freedom structured by specific absences. One of these is the erasure of labor. Art and finance both depend on the subjugation and expropriation of labor in order to realize their value in the market. This subjugation and expropriation also has to, perhaps preeminently, happen symbolically. The invisibility of labor, labor which is deemed profane and unproductive of this freedom that only money can guarantee, is a result of the emergence of speculation as the template for economic, but also personal and social valorization, when money makes money and workers are encouraged to see themselves as human capital. Where one society was structured by divergent class interests, the loss of the challenge that labor posed to capital, that of use value to exchange value if labor is seen as one side of the capital-labor relation, means that it now finds itself in a self-referential loop of the social logic of speculation. This self-referentiality, as opposed to the harmonious self-regulation that neoclassical economics has used to model social relations on market transactions, produces a kind of loss of measuring capacity. This loss has been called the obsolescence of the law of value by writers such as Negri, Hart, Virno, and Lazzarato. But perhaps such an erosion of measure speaks simply of the great expansion of that law, its fatal naturalization. Art operates in these conditions, but also upon them to transform their terms. As speculative commodities, art is backed by the credibility of the artist and money by the credibility of the state. Yet art is engaged in an endless testing of its own condition, which anticipates negations of the value form from the inside, rather than opposite to or beyond its own tensions. It is dispossessing and dispossessed, regardless of whether it can be sold and at how heady a price. Since value is relational, it is always open. This openness has the ambivalent potential for negation or accommodation. But this paradoxical position isn't simply the site of a conceptual tension. It is also a real contradiction, and this holds insofar as art needs to be apprehended as a particular type of commodity, one both like and unlike, the commodity of labor power, for example. This particularity inheres in artworks' singularity, a singularity secured through their mode of production, which is artisanal, at least in conception, as opposed to industrial, although, of course, there are industrial scales and sites of production. like Damien Hirst, Thomas Kincaid, or other more mass-producing entities. And not subsumed to the technical division of labor native to mass production, as well as through their production being determined by artistic subjectivity rather than social objectivity and their status, at least in principle, as unreproducible. These are the artwork's technical conditions of autonomy. In other words, they are the conditions of autonomy for artistic modes of production. This distinction retains the focus clearly on the dependence of these conditions in terms of what they reject, on the terms of what they reject, i.e. the heteronomy of productive labor. As such, this autonomy is the autonomy of the fetish. In the absence of a social situation in which the criticality or alterity of art, as just explained in its mode of production and its concept, may become generalized socially, art can only expand as art. The Marxian category of primitive accumulation denotes the ongoing extension of commodity relations to geographical and social sectors previously outside them. The enclosure of common land is usually taken as the historical or the imperialist example. The privatization of decommodified state services is a typical example in the present, even if that's rather different, since this is capital profiting from an earlier mode of its own expansion supported by the state.
Let's go straight to Devin.
I know I should get over you, but shouldn't all that I can do? We're drifting apart and I stand shattered hearted, but feel that there's much left to do. Although I like to thrive, I can't caress in the dark. Unfold you so deeply, be with you completely, relive through cameras on that die. Throw the past like it's cash. Throw the next, or just the best. Throw the past like Molotovs to draw the line they will not cross. Throw the past like milk splashes poured in air over eyelashes. Throw the past like orange straps tossed overhead of their bronze assets. Tardo un swipe en conocerte y solo un día en enamorarme, pero me llevará toda una vida poder olvidarte. He estado pensando en ti, pienso en ti todo el tiempo y solo puedo pensar en ti. Eres mi todo, my everything. You are my everything. Never had to sing a nude, blinking on the interlude. Future always in the mood, present always in the mood. Features pouring in its mood, amplified by a sign seen in you. Destined, driving by 10 and 2, 9 and 3. High to me, decidedly. Find a speed, VIPs, you and me. R.I.P., R&B, VIP, R&B. I think of you and seeing green. Think of you whenever I see green. Come over here next to me. I know I should get over you, but shouldn't all that I can do? We're drifting apart and I stand shattered hearted, but feel that there's so much left to do. Although I like to thrash, I can't caress in a dash. Hold you up so neatly, beat it up completely, leave the cameras on that night.
Okay, so maybe just some quick synthesis. So Devin Kilkenny is the name that an artist who uses performance called Devin Kenny uses as an aspect of their multidisciplinary practice. And one of the things I really enjoy talking to Emma Baziocon about is this kind of ever expanding, as it was put in the Marina Vishmet talk, this ever expanding field of art. So I think that's definitely something that I want to keep focusing on. So I'm at the beginning of that. I'm also at the beginning of trying to think about how specifically performance is valued, because I think I think that's a very important question for me to be asking as someone who is called a curator, and who focuses on performance. To think about how the kind of ever expanding field of art, which has a current system of value, is going to be further incorporating, and then this is not new, but further incorporating into its house methods of performance, and then who that engages. So we're going to go back to the conversation with Emma Baziocon and I again, and I believe that this next thing that we're going to talk about is in relation to debt.
That's amazing.
Why?
Because it's like it's like this idea of debt, right? Like, I want to do something for you, T, right? I want to do something really lovely for you.
Yeah.
And
yay!
and then, you'll go away, and I hope you're like, you enjoy this thing that I've done for you. Anytime I ask you to do something, that's going to come back, and you might be obliged. That's like a form of debt. So how do I do this thing for you without like generating this obligation in you?
Yeah, I struggle with that. Is that actually possible? Because I feel like kind of how I see that mechanism or that exchange or that gesture, like how it operates along the lines of debt for me is okay. So there's this part in the Cheryl Harris that I didn't play for you where she talks about debt having the fact of debt having two functions. So, you have, let's take France, Haiti, for example, right? So,
for sure.
Right? Yeah. So you have France basically creating a debt out of nothing, for something in which actually they are not owed.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
Okay, but and so that is a way of kind of using debt to say you owe me something, but at the same time, let's say hypothetically or actually in any kind of hypothetical or actual scenario where Haiti might argue for reparations, then it's like there is no debt now.
Yeah. So it's right? It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to this idea: you do something for me.
Yeah.
Right? How do you, or what is your opinion on, are you arguing for a kind of like an exchange between us in which there is no debt, or an exchange between us in which we both like consensually agree that we're just going to give to each other, and basically the expectation is that people just give according to their means, according to their capacity?
I don't know. I think I'm conflicted with that because actually I want to be able to give you something without you having to feel like you have to reciprocate it back. That's what I'm interested in. Like you don't like I don't come knocking and like you still have the power to say no. Like Imra, I can't do this for you now. But then sometimes because you remember this thing I did for you, you feel obliged to do it.
But what happens when you're doing things for me and I say to you, Emma, I can't do anything for you in the near future? And you keep doing stuff for me.
That's
you
okay.
have to make a decision about whether you're going to keep.
But this is what I mean. It's sincere. That's what I'm talking about. I genuinely then it calls into question, why am I doing this thing in the first place?
Yeah,
then? And that's what I mean.
Okay.
So I'm not talking about that. That's doing something with an agenda.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Like I'm not interested. I'm talking about like genuinely and genuinely I want to do this thing for you because I have that desire to do this thing for you.
Where does that desire come from?
I don't know. Like, I don't know.
Give examples.
Like, get on the freaking train and coming all the way down here.
No, but what?
No, but like...
Fair.
Okay, all right. So, there's a book that's just come out, and I know you'll be interested in that book, and I buy you this book. Like, just because I know T will be interested in this book. You know, like we had this conversation the other day, and it's like, oh my goodness, it's like triangulates a lot of things that we've been talking about recently. And like, yeah, I want to give you this book.
What triangulated things that we've been talking about
I'm
recently?
speaking
okay. I was like, what book? I didn't get a book.
So now you're giving me debt, and I feel like I need to go find a book. Is there any book for T? But that's what I mean. Like, that's like giving you an example, and then, you know, that's like something I might want to do. I mean, don't get your hopes up because I might not do it, but like,
yeah.
And then I do that for you, and then now, unknowingly, you maybe that becomes lodged in, right? In terms of
is that a type of that feels like what you're speaking about though feels really like feels really emotional. Are you suggesting that the debt that you're describing is a debt in which the currency is essentially emotional support? No?
Both.
Okay.
Because the thing is, you're not like, so for instance, like I said, so now that I've bought this book for you, right? 2 days later, I said to you, I need you to do this thing for me. I want you to be able to do it because you want to do it. Or say no because you want to say no, as opposed to like, Emma did this thing for me. Yeah. I feel obliged, and that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Like that, I still see that as a debt, like because what's happening?
Am I still in debt?
No, yeah, like I've given you a debt in a way. Like unknowingly, I've given you a debt. Like even though you may think like it's not a debt, what's happened is your power to say no has been kind of.
Yeah. Just I'd probably just go straight to the next one. I'm thinking, but I will probably talk after the Cheryl clip. Yeah, I think so.
Holders insisted that the debt would be owed them for taking away their property.
How the language of debt has created these ideas, and then thinking about reparations and affirmative action, and how the rhetoric around that is wound up in debt. And I guess I'm interested in that go-between, and I'm wondering if you could speak more about it.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you raised that, because this question of debt has really haunted the entire discourse for a very long time. So if we think about emancipation being controversial because slaveholders insisted that a debt would be owed them for taking away their property. And then the flip side of that is, of course, the demand of formerly enslaved Africans for payment of the debt due them for labor. You have this sort of debt being the mediating language for both claims of appropriation and claims of reparation. And so there's nothing sort of inherent about the concept that sort of makes it track any particular valence. It has been invested with these particular political meanings. What I'm been interested in, and as I said, I'm very glad that you raised it, is the way in which this notion of slave owners as having a right to extract payment for debt is still around. I mean, I know that might seem overstatement, but the notion that these sort of networks of capital can claim as a moral matter that a debt is due them for what I just went through, debt that they created is now asserted as a basis for collection. And through that process, the transfer of the public fisc to private hands. That's seen as a legitimate kind of debt collection situation. Yeah, but the demand for reparations and this notion of debt always is coming up against that resistance, like who owes who what, right? I think we know, but you know. That gentleman in the back right there.
I think so. It's kind of we're at this weird time where, in the popular imagination, there's still this this image of Detroit as being like a deindustrialized wasteland. I'm from Detroit, so I'm delighted to hear about you speak about it. Like when I tell people I'm from there, like, oh my God, how horrible is it? And in Bushwick, Brooklyn, there's all these billboards like recruiting people who are priced out of Brooklyn to move to Detroit because it's the land of opportunity. You can buy a house, you can be rich.
Wow.
And like, how do you kind of think of this, like the simultaneous rebranding of this area where there's still people there, but it's still vacant, but I mean, you can afford to live like a king there if you have the money, but the people who are there can't. I don't even know if that makes sense, but I'm just...
I think
No,
also in this, don't get
hear you.
distracted if
I hear
this
you.
Bushwick Detroit metaphor
I think
is not
that partly, like I
the place
said, in
that
addition to
you're
the
in.
fact that it's just been in the news, is just thinking about, I'm from the Midwest originally, I'm from Chicago, so it's right up the road. Why these spaces, in fact, are sort of become the, I guess I would say, the most vulnerable for these kinds of predations, really has to do with their durability as black spaces. And again, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that it's only black space that is subject to certain forms of this, but what I am trying to say is that there is a particular reason why it's Flint and Detroit. And even though this emergency management law that's lurking out there in Michigan is subject to attack a lot of poor, sort of economically deprived white towns, the discretion that's built into the infrastructure allows for officials to decide when that hammer comes down. Do you see what I'm saying? So, and that's where the racial presumptions come in terms of who is sort of competent to work their way out of a problem and who needs tutelage.
So I'm struck by and heartbroken by kind of the conundrum of the racial stoop, or what you described as the racial stoop. I'm curious as to what you think about the relationship is between kind of perceived black upward mobility and how that's often accompanied by the necessity to incur considerable amounts of debt. I think about education and the black body relationship to debt.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it has to do with the troubled relationship between blackness and property. And so having been sort of constituted as property, access to property of a material kind has always remained fraught, and those rights are always unstable, right? So ownership rights in the traditional sort of liberal property regime depend upon certain kind of subjectivities, and partly because we have not occupied that trustworthiness, reliability, all of those cultural traits, our relationship to property is always fraught. With respect to this sort of class mobility issue, this is what the economists and sociologists have been telling us for a long time, which is that the infrastructure upon which the black middle class status is built is far different from that of the white middle class. And a good deal of it is built on debt. And the jokes, that used to be told across the kitchen table about being three paychecks away from bankruptcy is part of what my father used to call the black tax. And so I say all that to say that I don't think that's unique, again, because, again, this sort of way in which the contradictions around lower wages, higher prices has been resolved is through debt. That's I think, more broadly true. But I think that the precarity of sort of black subjectivity means that the debt has this other dimension, and it goes back actually to the question that was asked earlier. Our relationship to debt is both as sort of debtor, and we aspire to making claims for debts that are owed us, but those are, for the most part, occluded, really. So that's, I don't know if that responds to your question exactly, but yeah.
Hi. You
Hi.
mentioned car loans, and you mentioned credit card or consumer loans. What about student loans?
Yeah, those are those are wicked. And here's the thing, so I teach at a public law school. I believe probably, I may have this wrong, but probably about 25 years ago, the cost of paying for tuition was under $15,000 a year, something like that. Now the cost of a law degree is somewhere north of $180,000. Okay, and we don't have to get out the little violins and cry for the lawyers, right? I'm not saying that. But I'm not saying that. But I am trying to say, in terms of the students that come to our project wanting to do social justice work, saddled with that kind of debt, or looking at the prospects of that kind of debt, what is it doing? It's taking out whole generations of people that actually have aspirations to do a different kind of work. And so there's all these kinds of effects of the ways in which education is now being funded. The other thing I would mention is the sort of subprime end of the education loan market, which we see all the time. So again, in California, and I'm sure the case is true here, community colleges are absolutely jam-packed. You can barely get a class. You can't. It takes years to actually get an Associate of Arts degree in some of the schools because there's just simply no places in the classes. And so what has that meant? Well, that's meant that there's a whole generation of young people that are coming out that cannot get into a four-year college because they either don't have the background or the money or whatever. And they can't get into community colleges either, or at least they can barely get into them, and they certainly have a very difficult time accumulating credits. And so what has that made them vulnerable to? That's made them vulnerable to the for-profit colleges and programs and universities. So there's a young man in our neighborhood at one of our favorite little neighborhood spots whose father owns the restaurant, and his father proudly told us a couple years ago that his son was in school, and I thought, great. Where was his son in school? His son was in school at some training program that was charging them $35,000 for some kind of certificate for 18 months, non-transferable credits, right? So what I'm trying to say is there's a sort of subprime end of the education loan market, much as there's the other end, right? Yeah, it's tough out here. Yeah. Yes?
When you spoke about fee harvesting, and then through the rest of your talk, I thought about how that's also happening with people who can't pay for tickets or summons, right? And how that ends up filling all of these municipal budgets and police budgets is just. I don't know. I wanted to know if you could talk about that.
I think that's the direct inheritance of what Cameron alluded to in his work, and what we talk about the ways in which the convict leasing system enacted itself was you first declared that the person was in debt to you. And then when you couldn't pay it, that subjected you to incarceration. We have another version of that, the Department of Justice tells us in Ferguson, right, in which you get stopped for a ticket, you can't pay, the fees ratchet up. And by the way, despite the fact that, we ostensibly don't have debtor's prison. That's exactly what this is. The courts have repeatedly rejected Eighth Amendment challenges to this on the grounds that somehow this isn't a violation of that notion, but it's patently false. And it also, I think, again, rests upon this notion of the kind of pay to stay, right? So now, in addition to being incarcerated, you get to pay for the privilege. And all of this is justified by this notion of the neoliberal state, right? The state can no longer even afford to incarcerate you, so you have to pay for your own incarceration. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes. Hi. Uh-huh.
I was wondering, besides abolishing capitalism, what are the sort of solutions to Black empowerment in terms of what you're talking about?
I don't know. I can't take that one off the table.
I thought that was funny. Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason why I let that Q&A kind of run through as it did, even though sort of what they're talking about, they stray very far from talking directly about art. But I do think this that particular set of questions encourages me, at least, to think about the nature of the transactions that we're entering into when we perform services in certain houses, certain spaces, and who comes away thinking that they are owed what. We're going to go back for one final time to the conversation with Emma Bazi, and then we're going to go back to Devin. And then we're going to go somewhere else, which I'll tell you about when we're ready to do so.
Status of art. The hermetic quality of speculation as it subsists in art and in finance can also be approached via the opacity and exoticism of new financial instruments. Not so new.
Opacity. We've talked about that.
Yeah, we have. I think with that sometimes, and I'm conscious that this is being recorded and this is going to sit somewhere public.
Not necessarily. We can cut things. I would not.
No. I don't mind this being in here. So basically, what I'm saying in terms of opacity is the things that we've talked about, right? In terms of what I'm really trying to do, or what this thing really is not for you. So there is some kind of device, right? But I don't want to tell people what that device is. So if you're sitting in a situation and you're speaking to someone and someone's asking you about the work, right? And you're like, okay, actually the device is precisely for you so that you don't have access to the thing that I want to do. So it's that situation now. It's I'm aware that some of this is going to get to some people, and actually, I don't want I don't want everyone.
Okay, can you take a minute? Just because I'm just thinking about the clinking. I'm sorry. Oh, come on, I can do it here. No, it can still be on you.
Yeah, and I just feel, and so that's always something I not maybe struggle with. And maybe why I don't maybe talking about the work actually, because I don't want to reveal that there was a device at play anyway. Do you know what I mean? It's I don't mind talking to you about this because I think that you are an audience. You are one of those people that I'm interested in having this conversation with.
Okay, but then why participate at all?
What do you mean?
Why participate at all if you got to do all these devices to?
Because there's a bit where
I'm not saying this from a position of being oh, you should just not participate.
No,
why participate at all?
Because there's a part of me that actually likes making this stuff. I'm interested in doing this stuff. Like I said before, it gives me joy. I get happy doing it. and this is the thing, like, how do I this is the thing, like, how do I take on board some of the things that I'm becoming increasingly concerned about, like, you know, listening to this talk with you, like some of the things she addresses, and at the same time coming back to vitality, how do I enjoy this thing that, like, I didn't come all this way to kind of like, you know, there's bits of it that actually I just like doing this thing, or like on a really formal level I'm like really interested in this, you know. But at the same time, how do I use that kind of like stage that I've got to kind of really actually deal with some of these things that are coming closer and closer. Like, they may be far away from me, they may not affect me so physically, but that it's coming for me in some way, right?
What's coming for you?
Like when we talked about like so like the glacier park, right? Like, that's over there at the moment, and there's a distance to it, so we can kind of like still kind of like play around and frolic and like blah 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 blah, but eventually that's coming closer, you know. So that's what I mean, like that threat is coming close in terms of like the consequences of that thing, right? So in a way, how do I like, that's becoming really important to me now. Like, my focus is on this now. Like, I can't not ignore that anymore, right? So how do I take that on, but also have fun over here at the same time? Without dissipating like energy or like getting, do you know what I mean?
Okay, can I switch gears really quickly and ask you, because I played that clip for you because I had an intuition that you would be interested in it.
Yeah.
Or I had a feeling that it would resonate with you, because, you know, we spoke about when you first listened to the clip, you asked me who around you do you feel is addressing these subjects, or who do you feel like is very skilled at addressing these subjects?
Yeah. Okay.
And I said, did I say no one? Or I said, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not pulling this. I'm pulling these different clips together, not because I know who I'm presenting them to then have that person say, oh yes, because I'm an expert in this thing, I'm gonna give you these things. I'm not doing it because of that. I'm pulling these clips together because I'm trying to figure out how to articulate what I feel is something that needs to be paid attention to.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So I was very pleased. I did derive a lot of vitality, joy, and pleasure from the recognition that I received from you by you saying, oh yeah, this is very important.
Yeah.
Why is it important?
Why is it important? Because it kind of, because I guess it makes very aware, like, the entanglement that we're in, or like participating in a mechanism that is not adequate for us, like participating in a mechanism or a system that we weren't supposed to be part of, you know.
Okay, were we not supposed to be part of it? How were we supposed to be a part of it?
How were we supposed to be a part of it? I don't think we were.
Oh, okay.
Like, it's not, like, it's like someone, it's like this, it's like someone builds a house, right? Okay. Maybe I shouldn't use this example. Like, someone builds a house that's like bespoke to them in nature, their stature, their gait, the way they move. And then all the people that look like them and that have the same stature are able to inhabit this house. And then they get bored, or for whatever reason it's like, oh, we need to open this relationship. Yeah, basically it's like, it's just too much for whatever reason. And then they realize actually the other people that they want, that house is inadequate. So then they keep hacking it, like doing like these kind of like licking and like putting plasters everywhere, and actually it just needs to come down. Because it wasn't in the first place designed for everybody. You made it exclusively for you to function in a particular way, you know. And that's what I mean, like, it's not, is made for a particular. I feel that anyway.
Mm. And that's why you're interested in that talk.
Yeah, and just also like I guess the reason why, like I feel like I'm interested in that talk for loads of different reasons. Just like in terms of like she makes all these connections. I don't want to say like she identifies like the enemy, but like yeah, in terms of like what's at stake, in terms of like there's these real things, there's these real problems with this thing that we're participating in. That is kind of like this economy that we're not necessarily aligning ourselves in, but we've been forced or we've had to kind of like participate in, you know. And this is what I mean, like how do you, and I'm aware of that, but how do you take that on board? Because I agree with what she's saying, but at the same time, like there's this desire to continue making these things that I'm interested in. So like so what's the strategy for that?
Yeah,
and that's what I'm interested in. Like what is the strategy for that? Like how do you? And sometimes it's not so like direct to like exploitation. Sometimes it's not so direct to like it's maybe just other things, like more personal things, just like you want things from me like immediately, and actually I don't work on immediacy. Like it takes me a long time to kind of think through things and sit with things. They could be as simple as that, right? But like I'm just interested in now, like what are those strategies and how what does it look like?
I guess why I feel like that talk is important to me is because there's a notion about the kind of ever expanding field of art, right? That, you know, expands to include more and more types of gestures, more and more types of materials, objects, processes, methodologies, right? And things just, I don't know if the field of art necessarily grows to, you know, like this kind of foam coming out of a washing machine to just like cover more and more things, or whether more and more things are introduced into this container. I don't know. Maybe it's both, right? Maybe that distinction is not necessarily important. But as that expansion takes place, I think what the nature of that expansion in this moment to me is about who and what it's for, like who and what the presentation of art is for, can touch, is designed to speak towards, right? Like there's this like impulse to make art relevant, heavy quotes, art capital A,
yeah,
relevant and accessible to more people, which, as I said to you earlier, essentially functions to say, you know, we have this very like exploitative labor system that actually doesn't really, even if you were going to say like, oh, you know, the nature of work is fine, it's all good, the nature of work is not, is something in which all parties, you know, go in with complete autonomy and leave with complete autonomy and everything's all good. Even if that was the case, which is not.
Yeah.
To then say, oh yeah, we actually have this system that even along the lines of work actually functions in a very, or is dysfunctional, but we want more people in it now.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I feel like that's important to me.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, I think of what, like, yeah, no, I agree. Like, I think she, like I said, like she just kind of like hits on like lots of different things.
What did you say in the kitchen earlier that you were like, oh, I'm gonna save it?
That's something completely different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just. But then this is what I mean. It still comes back to this thing about you design this thing which doesn't work, and it's what I mean. It's inadequate. Like, so it's not sincere. The gesture is not sincere.
So, just to recap, I think I said everything I need to say in terms of interpretation, but just to recap in case folks have joined late in terms of what we just listened to. So we went through a kind of, I guess you'd call it a round robin, between three different speakers. We started out with Cheryl Harris's recent talk at the I believe it was 2015 or 16, Cameron Rowland exhibition at Artist Space in New York. Then we went to a conversation between myself and Emma Bazio-Cohn, who's got a show upcoming that opens on, I believe, June 27th at Chisenhall Gallery in London. That conversation started from our communal listening to a talk from 2012 by Marina Vishmet on, I guess, the relationship between art and money. And we kind of went back and forth between hearing those three things. So if you haven't been with us for so long, that's what we've just done. We're going to take a quick break and listen to some more Devin Kilkenny. And then after that, we're going to talk about performance again with someone who has been, or who is known for a long time to have been analyzing the kind of modes of performance and poetry. I guess poetry, but I guess I'm sort of saying that I'm interested in poetry at the stage in which it is performed, right? And one of the people who I know of, who's been analyzing the origins of that for some time, is Anne Carson. Now, I came to Anne Carson through a book called The Economy of the Unlost, which is a book that analyzes poetic economy of two poets. One is, I believe, Paul Celan, and the other one is an ancient Greek poet, Simonides, who is discussed as a poet who, upon the introduction of coins in the society that he was living in, decided that instead of trading his poetry essentially for friendship, the friendship of an aristocracy, said, basically, I don't want to be friends with you, give me the money. So let's listen to Anne talk about something else related to poetry, which I actually don't remember at this moment what it is, but after she says it, I'm sure I'll remember why I put it in here, and we'll talk about it. Yes, it's the song playing now. So we're going to go from Devin Kilkenny, and then we'll go to Anne Carson.
Some activists might wonder what the point of protesting is if it has no impact on success. There is, however, another way to look at structuralism that is invigorating rather than paralyzing. Assume that human action, the form of protest, or organizational style has no significant impact on whether a movement will succeed. To recap, all that matters is that a contesting group exists prior to and continues protesting during a world historic crisis. Let's go further and propose that the outcome of the revolution is not up to human will, and therefore total inaction when the food price index exceeds 210 will have the same chances of hastening a revolutionary victory as action. Now what do you do to change the world? How do you act? A few people may choose to do nothing, twiddle their thumbs, and just wait for the revolution to happen. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, however, once observed that a person would rather will something than nothing. And I suspect the majority would still choose to act. And if choosing a tactic based on effectiveness is not possible, because all forms of protest are equally effective in a purely structuralist worldview, the best course of action would be to choose the tactics with superior secondary benefits. If protest can't hasten revolution, activists are free to protest in ways that bring happiness or vibrant community or beautiful art. What do you do when organizing a global march, painting an urban mural, or feeding hungry people during a world crisis have equal chances of sparking social change? You choose the action that speaks to you, the action most authentic to becoming yourself. This possibility gestures towards how new tactics come into being spontaneously, and it helps us understand anomalous protest tactics such as the ghost dance of 1890, a prophetic circle dancing ritual performed by indigenous people in North America that originated in a bid to hasten the return of their sovereignty. The ghost dance was explicitly understood by its participants as a ritual with political consequences. The dance was effective enough to warrant being violently suppressed by the US government. A rational voluntarist would be hard-pressed to explain why dancing in a circle far away from cities would be a threat to government. Voluntarist would be hard-pressed to explain why dancing in a circle far away from cities would be a threat to government. A structuralist activist, however, understands that a protest does not need to target authorities to be effective. It need only be recognized as a protest at the right time.
So again, that was Devin Kilkenny, and you've been hearing throughout this program songs from Devin's newest LP, Los Giros de la Siguiente. And now let's go to Ann Carson, talking about corners, turning corners, and ancient Greek poets.
Of three speaking actors. According to Aristotle, it was Sophocles in the 5th century BC who introduced the third actor to a dramatic tradition that had contented itself with two until then. It seems that the practice of using three actors became canonical. Scholars refer to this as the three-actor rule. No one knows why it was a rule. Why did they stop at three? One hypothesis is economic. Actors were highly trained and highly paid professionals with salaries underwritten by the state. Since the plays were presented in the context of a competition, the Festival of Dionysus, as soon as one playwright decided to use three actors, everybody would want three actors and the annual theater budget would sharply rise. Besides that, the evidence of Sophocles' stagecraft might suggest that three actors are really all you need to make a tragedy work. Each of his plays presents harrowing triangular situations where two characters bring pressure to bear on a third who is trapped between them and cracks open, or two knowledges that collide together to force out a third that nobody wants to see. We can think of the opening scene of the Ajax, where Athena and Odysseus hunt down poor mad Ajax. Or Oedipus the king, where the king, the messenger, and the herdsman lock in a conversational pattern that spits out the guilt of Oedipus. No one can operate this three-cornered machinery better than Sophocles. So I wonder what it was like to be one of his rival playwrights in the year Sophocles decided to demand a third actor. Suddenly, the other guys, too, would have to come up with a new way to make a play work, having a third body on stage, a third psyche in the chemistry of the cast, a third corner to the concept. Circumstantial evidence suggests this took place in 458 BC. Sophocles' principal rival that year was Aeschylus, who was 67 and 2 years away from death. He had spent the last 40 years producing plays for the Festival of Dionysus and had won first prize 12 times. None of these plays had any use for a third actor. But in 458, Aeschylus produced the Oresteia trilogy, which makes use of a third actor in all three parts. Sadly, we don't know what plays Sophocles presented that year, but Aeschylus' Oresteia won first prize. Let's look at two of the scenes where his third actor figures. There is a gleam of one-upmanship in the manner of it. The Agamemnon opens with an announcement of the fall of Troy. Then Clytemnestra comes on stage to await the return of her husband, Clytemnestra, first actor. Next, Agamemnon enters with an entourage of prisoners of war. Agamemnon, second actor. Amid the prisoners is Cassandra, princess of Troy and concubine of Agamemnon, third actor. But this third actor doesn't speak for a long, long time. Husband and wife trade apologias of their virtue back and forth for 192 lines, while Cassandra listens. Or doesn't listen. It is unclear whether she is stubborn, stupid, psychotic, or doesn't know the language. All of these possibilities are advanced by Clytemnestra, who interrogates Cassandra after Agamemnon has gone inside. Cassandra's silence remains impermeable. Clytemnestra, in a rage, exits. As soon as Clytemnestra leaves the stage, Cassandra screams and launches into 258 lines of prophecy, outlining the past, present, and future of the house of Atreus, as well as the imminent doom of all three major characters. Aeschylus has taken the device of the third actor, introduced by Sophocles for who knows what technical reasons of his own, and used it to transcend normal limits of space and time and intelligence. Cassandra shines with mental power, which is also moral power, and she has more forms of truth than she can live with. She is merely a third angle of the tragic triangle, but her silence pulls all the focus of the story into her corner and explodes it. Silence is a big, crude, theatrical substance. Pinter uses it to Aeschylean effect in a play from 1961 called A Slight Ache, in which a husband and wife, Edward and Flora, interact with a man who sells matches, in much the same way Clytemnestra interacts with Cassandra in the Agamemnon. The match seller stands silent for the entire length of the play, while Edward and Flora interrogate him. Violent forms of truth emerge from both husband and wife. The end is tragic. Edward suddenly, for no reason, falls to the floor and is replaced as husband by the match seller. It is a typically unpleasant Pinter play. The characters exist in a suspension of humaneness. Edward and Flora strike poses rather than talking or touching. It's hard to feel pity or fear for either of them, or for the match seller, whose silence pulls all the focus of the story onto himself, but then swallows it. He never speaks. We never know what things are like on his strange side of reality. Pinter has said in interviews that he thinks most human talk is an evasion, a desperate rearguard attempt to keep ourselves to ourselves. He intends his characters who speak to speak the language of what we say instead of what we mean. The silent match seller is a step beyond that. He neither speaks nor means anything. He has given up on language. In the Agamemnon, Aeschylus uses Cassandra's silence at first to tease us into thinking she has given up on language, and at the same time perhaps tease us into thinking this playwright doesn't know how to use his third actor. Then her mouth opens and language pours all over the place. Aeschylus does something equally adept in the Koiphoroi, which is the second play of the Oresteia trilogy. It has a third actor in only one scene, the scene where Orestes murders his mother. The third actor is Orestes' trusty comrade Pylades, who enters the play beside Orestes at line 20 and stands unspeaking, unaddressed, and unmentioned through 898 lines of action and dialogue. Then at line 899, Orestes, hesitating to murder his mother, turns to Pylades and says, "Pylades, what should I do?" And Pylades, from his all but forgotten corner, utters 3 lines of encouragement, and the tragedy plunges on to its grisly end. It would be hard to mistake Aeschylus's dramaturgic control of Sophocles' newest innovation. Corners Part 2. The person I live with says our house is too dark. It's true we have no big overhead fixtures or lighting tracks, just small thrift store lamps placed here and there. It constitutes a main difference between him and me, between extroverts and introverts generally, between people who prefer to live in a centrally and democratically lit open space, and people who like a darkish room with a small pool of lamplight in one corner, between exposure and retreat. To be withdrawn into one's corner can be a situation of personal peace, if we think of the corner as a sort of half box, part walls, part door. That is, as a place offering defense at the back and mobility at the front. A perfect middle term in what Bachelard calls the dialectics of inside and outside. One thing I noticed about my dad as he disappeared into his dementia, he lost the sense of the personal peace of corners. A seriously introverted man who had always preferred to sit in a rocking chair in the corner of his room with the cat on his lap, reading or thinking or watching the world go by, began to be found perched all alone on a folding chair in the middle of the front lawn, or standing halfway down the driveway with a baffled look, or simply wandering room to room with his hat on. I am the space where I am, says Bachelard. Demented people do not seem to experience the self as a shelter. There is some basic animal certainty that you are who you are and it's okay, that is deleted from them. No more dialectic of inside and outside. You are simply exposed. You are open to all the winds. Your life is taking place in that space that the ancient Greek philosophers called to apeiron, the unbounded, which was synonymous with chaos for Hesiod, while to Shakespeare it might be the heath, to Emily Bronte the moors, to Samuel Beckett a late evening in the future, but which my dad acutely described in the last complete sentence I had from him in this way: fires are the furthest in you are and the worst you are. Notice the direction of the...
Okay, so I like that Anne Carson kind of said something about those 2 knowledges that force out a third, and also this thing of Sophocles demanding a third actor and how that was refused on the basis of money, which I think is a dynamic that many of us might be familiar with some thousands of years later. So I've been thinking as she was talking, again in that excerpt, and thinking about the places in which we perform, what fuels us to get to that point, and who we bring with us, as Maya Angelou had said, and also the potential that in the idea that what fuels us to get to that point of performance might remain unseen as it doesn't appear visibly on stage. This is not improvised. I've been writing this while Anne Carson has been talking. I don't know if that counts as a freestyle or not. In some cases, I would argue that it would be useful for performers actually to focus more on that third actor in this tragic triangle between the house, the performer, and the witness or the audience, as Anne Carson names them. And I guess acknowledging that the formulation of these houses or these specific sites in which we perform as property, which is something that is supposedly protected from the consequences of loss by law, and we got that from Brenna Bandar earlier, and also a bit from Cheryl Harris after that. I'm interested in this kind of dialectic between the outside and the inside that Ann Carson talks about as well. It reminded me of something that I forgot to say in the beginning, which is about the intention to kind of do this symposium in this format. This is designed to be a symposium that you don't have to leave the house for, and I did that on purpose because I didn't necessarily want to go outside literally, but kind of metaphorically, I'm interested in this idea of like what is inside this house that we're working in, and what's outside that house, and how is that boundary decided, and what might we, as I'm kind of getting from Marina Vishmet, what we might need to pay attention to as that boundary between what is in what is within that boundary and what we might need to pay attention to as that expands. I selected excerpts from talks that already exist throughout this symposium, which I'd actually intended to be much longer, but yeah, sometimes it's just like that, isn't it? And I'm going to talk about why I chose excerpts. I think maybe after this next place we go, which is actually a revisitation from where we started, to this conversation between Gale Lewis and Hortense Spillers, which happened last summer. So let's go to that. And then I think after that, Jay, you have actually just been emailed. Jay, check your email, because there's the final piece of what we're going to discuss here is in Jay's email. And hopefully this conversation between Gale and Hortense gives Jay some time to pull that out. And I'll talk about that when that comes.
Gesture towards the making of something to come.
Yeah. You know, I've been thinking about that a lot, because it seems to me it's time to try to rethink certain positions that we have taken over time, and I've come to this conclusion, or this is what I think about the ungendering formulation and ideas related to it now. That it's an analytical device that made a certain discourse possible, that makes a certain discursive intervention possible. It's a heuristic device, it's a conceptual framework, and I think it's very plausible in relationship to what I understand about the history of diasporic communities and people. But I think our reception of it has to be double, that we have to have a double vision or a double consciousness of it, in this sense that it is a useful device on the one hand, but it need not be reified on the other, if that makes sense. I mean, in other words, we have to live our lives, right? And if you get stuck in the reification of an idea, then you cannot live your life progressively, you know? I mean, one day after the next, one foot in front of the other. So I think we have to observe it along dual tracks, that there's the theoretical and then there's the practical. There's the conceptual, and then there's the everyday world in which I must live my life. And I think what happens, say, with the Afro-pessimist position is that, and I don't think this is an Afro-pessimist position, even though the Afro-pessimists have claimed it as a part of their position. I think the Afro-pessimistic position really lands in reactionism. that it really lands in a kind of deadly conservative closure. That we stop right here. And that's not what you want to do. I mean, you have to get beyond the stop signs, right? You come to a stop, boom, hit the brakes, and then, okay. And you take off again. And I think that's what we have to do with our theorizing. That we have to have the theories because they help us understand our relationship to other discourses that we both support and agree with and disagree with in other cases, that it helps a theoretical understanding which widens the world out and the way we see it. All of that happens with theoretical tools. But in addition to that, and running parallel to it or concurrently with it, is the need to get on with our lives, with what we know about the theoretical and about ideas. And so that's the way I would read that. That I would not want to see a reification or a reading it back into my own historical subjectivity or subjecthood as though it exhausted my possibilities, right? Because it does not. I mean, it certainly defines how I am situated in the world that calls me by my name, or by whatever other name it's calling me, and I have to answer to all of them, whether I like them or not, and to try to be responsible to them. But I'm not exhausted by that, right? I'm that plus, and so it's the plus that I'm trying to get to, and that's what I mean when I talk about a duality or a dual track understanding of our relationship to the theoretical.
Yeah. So it's like Nina Simone says, I want the left hand finally got going. Like you need more than one.
Yeah.
Or one of the, yeah. And that's beautiful actually, because one of the things I was I wanted to say really was when I was looking back over your work for today, and I was thinking, you know what, Gale, kind of think what Hortense's work does is produce a kind of topological formation. You know, you give us the shapes of space. You know, it's not a cartography in the straightforward way, but there's something much more about the production of it, or showing us how to think about, plot the shapes of space, how to do work topologically, in a sense. And where did that come so beautifully? And those of you who, well, everyone in the room, of course, has read the essays. But the opening one, the introduction, Peter's Pans, eating in the diaspora. And the last section is all about food and eating. And one of the things that Hortense says in that, she says, the trick, nevertheless, is that the shadow does not always fall where we think it might. With food, then, we are both at home and abroad, a product of a particular urban block or a spot of provincial countryside, and a worldling of multi-languages and cultures. I see no need to choose. And it seemed to me that what you were really announcing there was precisely that we have the possibility of creating or seeing the trace of and then expanding these different spaces of location through which we might act and form a politics across a range of relational positions. And how do you show us that? She tells us that Hoppin' John, which I know as rice and peas, where did she have the best Hoppin' John? Now, if you think of the map of London and you think of Black Presence, you're not going to think Fulham. She tells us she has the best Popping John rice and peas, and tells us about the coconut milk and all the things we must, and how we must absolutely know when to put the rice into the peas, and so that, you know, everything stands, the grains are separate, but the peas don't mush, and we can still taste the coconut. And I always put a little bit of chili with mine, and there's a whole section in that about peppers and the different. But here we have another map of London, in other words, through eating the diaspora, it seems to me, and thinking about the relationships, that we get a kind of vision of a topological space in which we might imagine ourselves precisely in the sense of a black...
All right. So that was a conversation, or an excerpt of a conversation between Hortense Fillers and Gale Lewis that happened last summer. So yeah, I think Hortense and Gale have kind of offered us something as to why we have theory, sort of not to explain to us why we stopped the car, but to fix us up to keep going, essentially, is how I interpret that. And then also I think Gale was talking about how we then use that to work on the land that we're walking on and like what we can yield from it, right? Which is the food or the fuel. And I know why I chose to have this symposium over what is essentially, you know, online or the radio. But I also wanted to ask someone who I know knows a fair amount more than I do about the uses of radio. And so we're going to hear in a minute something that I actually have not heard before this very moment, from Emil Kaloff, who is an amazing curator / all these other things, which don't necessarily need to be named here. I guess what I just want to communicate is that I think that her perspective on radio has been very formative to me. So I wanted to kind of get her to articulate herself, and yeah, I might come back after that to talk about the music that we've been listening to as well. But anyway, hopefully we can go to this response from Emma on radio.
In their 10 theses on militant sound investigation, Ultra Red described their research as a lexicon of analytical concepts that seeks to rethink a new pedagogy of the ear. And I've been thinking a lot about what it is that makes up this pedagogy of the ear and the ways that we can intervene in this pedagogy. After working with Ultra Red for over 5 years, about 10 years ago, listening has now become completely part of how I work. I would say listening is probably the key descriptor of any approach I have to working with others and to produce the projects that I work on. A lot of the work I do is made up of sound-based field work, listening sessions, sound walks, working with sonorous objects, and these are my approaches to how we as art workers can approach the cities and the struggles within the cities that we live in today. Listening for me is a space of political encounter. It's a space of encounter that listening is a space for political encounter in order to develop a collective mode of action. For me, listening makes up the main space in my pedagogical toolkit. Especially when it comes to working collectively, especially with campaigns and artists and various other activist groups. Even in contexts like early childhood centers, I've come to understand listening through theories developed through Reggio Emilia approaches, teaching us to listen with our whole body. And I love it when they describe the act of listening as a way to be transported to where the other wants to go so that a real dialogue can begin. At the same time as listening, I'm also thinking a lot about broadcasting and making sounds, thinking through sounding. I've been thinking about the ways that vibrations may become a way of understanding diaspora and the spread of different political solidarities across space. I've been thinking about how the sonic space and sonic practices have a racialized heritage, and these ideas and this thinking has become a departure point for many projects that I'm working on today. I think a lot about the entanglements of race with sound, concepts of voice, pedagogy, and the colonial archive. I've been thinking about racial ideologies, identities, and violence, and how intimately bound up they are with sound and listening practices. I think about the constructions of race and class and identities through broadcast, and what happens when we make radio today, or if we think about how we intervene in radio and broadcasting. What are the ways in which different people of color or colonial subjects have intervened in the white listening ear? And how have non-white subjects listened to sounds of agency and political action? In what ways can practices of listening help us to account for positionalities and historical continuity? Blech. Ignore that, Mia. How to say that sentence.
Mel's going to kill me because I'm playing this straight through rather than cutting it up and splitting it in
electromagnetic
places.
radiations function at a bigger than planetary scale? How might it function in an internal microscale? How might radio and acousmatic sounds reverb without a cause or echo without a source? How could radio offer a model of reorganizing relationships between individuals and the world? And what solidarities emerge from the recognition of our participation in a transmission?
All right, so that's everything. I think rather than respond once more, because I think that was pretty clear, maybe that last and also rather than kind of try to, I'm a bit tired now, and so rather than kind of try to draw a connection or split that back up into other things. I might actually just want to play that last Devin Kilkenny song that we listened to again, Jay, that one that we listened to right before we listened to Ann Carson. Maybe we just play that again, and then that might be it. Thank you for listening. This was Fuel and Property, the second event in a series of programs called False Dichotomy, which I have organized on the 30th anniversary of Wising Art Center. And I'll see some of you, hopefully, on the 30th of May at the final event in this series, which is called Networking Contact, which features Free Yard, Rizvana Bradley, who is someone who I think can kind of pick up this line of what we're supposed to do with all this theory that Hortense has posed to us, and two amazing poets, writers, theorists, and literary activists in themselves, Dorothea Smart and also Mumtaza Mehri, who was recently the Young Poet Laureate of London. So hopefully I'll see you all on the 30th. And thanks for listening today.
Some activists might wonder what the point of protesting is if it has no impact on success. There is, however, another way to look at structuralism that is invigorating rather than paralyzing. Assume that human action, the form of protest or organizational style has no significant impact on whether a movement will succeed. To recap, all that matters is that a contesting group exists prior to and continues protesting during a world historic crisis. Let's go further and propose that the outcome of the revolution is not up to human will, and therefore total inaction when the food price index exceeds 210 will have the same chances of hastening a revolutionary victory as action. Now what do you do to change the world? How do you act? A few people may choose to do nothing, twiddle their thumbs, and just wait for the revolution to happen. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, however, once observed that a person would rather will something than nothing. And I suspect the majority would still choose to act. And if choosing a tactic based on effectiveness is not possible, because all forms of protest are equally effective in a purely structuralist worldview, the best course of action would be to choose the tactics with superior secondary benefits. If protests can't hasten revolution, activists are free to protest in ways that bring happiness or vibrant community or beautiful art. What do you do when organizing a global march, painting an urban mural, or feeding hungry people during a world crisis have equal chances of sparking social change? You choose the action that speaks to you, the action most authentic to becoming yourself. This possibility gestures towards how new tactics come into being spontaneously, and it helps us understand anomalous protest tactics such as the ghost dance of 1890, a prophetic circle dancing ritual performed by indigenous people in North America that originated in a bid to hasten the return of their sovereignty. The ghost dance was explicitly understood by its participants as a ritual with political consequences. The dance was effective enough to warrant being violently suppressed by the U.S. government. A rational voluntarist would be hard-pressed to explain why dancing in a circle far away from cities would be a threat to government. Voluntarist would be hard-pressed to explain why dancing in a circle far away from cities would be a threat to government. A structuralist activist, however, understands that a protest does not need to target authorities to be effective. It need only be recognized as a protest at the right time.